And Becca, can you go ahead and initiate sharing on Facebook for us?
I am. We are live.
All right, so again, good evening, everyone. My name is Letha Muhammad. I am the Director of Education Justice Alliance. Education Justice Alliance is a grassroots community-based organization in Raleigh, and we work around dismantling the school to prison pipeline and the school to deportation pipeline, and to stop the over-criminalization of Black and Brown students in our public school systems, with a particular focus on Wake County Public Schools, but are always available to help folks from across the state with this issue. I want to introduce Alex Evans, who's a staff attorney at Disability Rights North Carolina, to introduce himself and his organization.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Evans. I'm a staff attorney, as she said, at Disability Rights on the education team. I'm going to pass it over to our supervising attorney, Jenny Fogg, to introduce our organization.
Thank you, Alex. I'm Jenny Fogg. As Alex said, I'm the supervising attorney of the special education team at Disability Rights North Carolina. Our team in particular represents students pre-K through 12th grade with disabilities who attend public schools in our state. And Disability Rights North Carolina is our state's federally mandated protection and advocacy organization for people with disabilities. And we advance and defend the rights of people with disabilities statewide throughout their lifespan in our state.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that introduction of the important work that Disability Rights is doing for citizens in North Carolina. Next, I'd like to introduce Felicia Arriaga from NC SPAN to share a little bit about her and the work she's connected with.
Sure, thank you. So NC SPAN, or the North Carolina Statewide Police Accountability Network, is a statewide alliance of North Carolina organizations who agree to work together collectively to amplify the voices and the work happening in our local communities. We tend to do this particularly from an abolitionist perspective. And so some of the things that we provide are rapid response support. My bad, Fernando, I will go slower. Rapid response support, as well as capacity building and additional research for community groups across the state of North Carolina.
Oh, I was on mute. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm gonna kick it back over to Alex so he can give us an overview of HB 247, the bill that is bringing us all together tonight. So go ahead, Alex.
All right, thank you, Letha. So HB 247, just to give a little history, this is a bill that has been refiled and brought back in. It was originally, it's on student code of conduct, student standards of conduct. And 10 years ago, this bill went through. And with the advocacy of stakeholders at the time, there were some language that was put into the bill, which included examples of conduct that would not be deemed as a serious violation that would be up for long-term suspension. Those examples were inappropriate or disrespectful language, non-compliance with the staff directive, dress code violations, and minor altercations that did not involve weapons or injury. So what's taken place now, 10 years later, is that those examples are being cut out of this bill, which then leaves the discretion for those minor subjective misconducts or events to be placed in the hands of school administrators to then make a decision on whether those actions can be put up for a long-term suspension, which would be over 10 days from school. One thing to keep in mind is that a 10-day suspension equals up to over 10 days. I mean, excuse me, 5% of the school year. So it is very significant amount of time in someone's time in school. Another provision within the bill in which we are particularly focused on is the inclusion of law enforcement in the adoption and governance of the school student conduct. For both of these provisions, they're both very particularly tied into ramifications of racial discrimination, gender discrimination, as well as discrimination based on ability. Studies and research shows that the subjective infractions are definitely placed on students of color, particularly Black students, and students with disabilities. That's just an overview. We can kind of get into a little bit more of it as we continue with the conversation.
Thank you, Alex, for the overview. And just for our listening audience, feel free to use the chat box to post questions. We will have a question and answer section towards the end of our conversation. Also, if you're on Facebook and you're watching us live on Facebook, also feel free to drop your questions on the Facebook live, and we'll capture those questions and try to get those answered as well. So to kind of spark conversation, we have a couple of questions that we'll ask Alex or Felicia or Jenny to answer if she wants to weigh in around this bill, because what we really want you all to understand, our community, right, is why you should be alarmed that this bill has been reintroduced and what the potential harms could be if this bill is allowed to move through. I have one quick question about who is sponsoring the bill before we drop a little deeper in conversations. Do we know who is the sponsors for this particular bill?
Yes, we do. It's Representative Torbett in the House of Representatives, Representative Torbett, who is out of representing Gaston County.
All right, perfect. And currently the bill is situated where?
So it passed the House Committee of Education, K through 12 education, and then it passes on to rules, which it is sitting there currently.
In the Rules Committee. And Felicia, can you talk to us a little bit about what that means when a bill is situated in the Rules Committee?
I can talk about it in sort of the context of who's in the Rules Committee. And so I just dropped the link. If you're watching on Facebook, we can drop it, I think, in the comments. But if you go to the ncledge.gov site, you can look up these committees. And so the House Standing Committee that Alex just mentioned has a few sort of different folks. Unfortunately, the leadership is predominantly Republican. So whenever we think about when bills or proposals get called to be discussed, it typically is up to the chair and to that leadership to decide when that happens. I'm sure sort of Alex and the folks from Disability Rights NC can talk a bit more about the likelihood of when that might be. But in there, they typically have sort of a regular meeting schedule. But because those Republicans and Representative Torbett is part of is a vice chair, you can expect that this might be one of his bills that he wants to really see passed, right? So we know that that matters. Some of the members who are in that committee, so there's a series of committees that each proposal will have to go through to eventually get to the House floor in this case. I'm so sorry. Fernando. So there's a series of individuals who are on the members of the committee, that often whenever we're talking about legislation that especially might be moving quickly, we ask that folks reach out to those representatives and have a discussion with them about why you oppose or support, but in this case, oppose this particular one. So we do have a handful of both Democrats and Republicans who are members of that committee. And so we asked often that you can go there, look at who your representative is, especially if there are representatives that you recognize, and really just convince them that, or try to talk to them so that they at least slow down the passing, because once it moves from here, then it does continue on in the process. And so there are some, as we think about the legislative process, there are specific dates when we know that it may cross over into the other sort of house. We have two houses that this process goes through. But there is a list of folks there who may be more sort of eager to discuss this, right? And so we tend to ask folks to either directly send them emails, call them. If you're feeling like you want to take a drive, maybe do a caravan, honk at their house. There's a lot of different ways that you can at least start to bring this issue and bring some awareness about the issue. So that's at least where we see it situated. I don't know, Alex or Jenny, if y'all want to talk about maybe the likelihood of it moving in the next maybe week or so.
Thank you, Felicia. Alex, do we have any insight about the likelihood of it moving?
Yeah, so like Felicia said, this is a bill that Representative Torbert really wants to push through. So during this week, they've been on somewhat of a spring break, but next week they're getting back in. And we expect that it only stays in rules for a short amount of time. So we expect for it to get back in the pipeline very soon. So that's why we're doing this collective advocacy at this point in time and really trying to get in front of the ball now.
Thank you. And shout out to Peter for dropping the link in the chat box. We appreciate that, where you can find out who your representatives are and find out ways to contact them. And towards the end of this discussion, we'll have some other ways that you can be engaged in this advocacy and community organizing effort as well. So the burning question for me as a parent, as a citizen in North Carolina, and I'm assuming for, folks in our listening audience, why should we be concerned about this particular bill? But you talked a little bit about it, Alex, in your overview, but if you could go a little deeper as to why we should be concerned, that would be very helpful.
Right. So, I mean, I think that, first of all, I'm very uniquely situated. Just want to let everyone know I'm very uniquely situated on this issue, as I actually wrote my dissertation on this what we refer to as the school to prison pipeline here in the state of North Carolina. So I've been able to look at the history of school discipline within the state, right? And one thing that we see is that 20 years ago, 20 years ago or so, after Columbine, they placed police in schools, right? And then there were outcomes of that were not optimal. Students were then pushed into prisons at high numbers. We were seeing different issues of police brutality. The numbers of school suspensions were really high. So one thing in particular that just really jumps out to me is that around 10 years ago, I think it was in 2010, the school suspensions across the state were somewhere around, the short-term suspensions were around 277,000, right? But then if we jump all the way into now, right, into the latest data that we have, it's all the way down by 120,000, right? So there's been this push, this progress to move away from suspending students, right? And then if we look at long-term suspensions, we go from over 2,500 all the way down to just 400. So this steep decline in suspensions is due to the advocacy around ending the school to prison pipeline or ending school pushout. But what this particular bill does is not only does it take those subjective offenses that we've been trying to move away from to move down the numbers of suspensions, but it also, again, places law enforcement within the governance of school discipline, right? Which is problematic because that was the impetus for a lot of these different issues, right? And it causes a carceral type of atmosphere for our schools, which is what we're ultimately trying to get away from. We're ultimately trying to get to a place where we do not need law enforcement in schools at all, and definitely not involved in the enforcement of any school discipline. I think that with the year that we experienced last year, especially last summer, in which we saw the various things in our societies, students are very, they're very in touch with what's going on in the outside world and in their world, in their everyday world. So they're faced with the stark realities of racial injustice, and I think that this is a racial justice issue. This is an ability issue. This is also is a gender issue, because it also the dress code violation. Young women face discrimination based off of their dress code all the time, based off their size, based off their race, based off of an intersection of their identity. So I think there are various levels, and I can talk for days on why we should be interested or really care about this issue.
Context matters and it's important, right? And I really appreciate you giving us that additional context and framing. For me as a parent, this is an issue that matters to me in my personal life. I have 2 high schoolers currently attending Wake County Public Schools who are Black students. And when we look at discipline data for across North Carolina, we have to name and recognize that there is a disparity that exists, right? Where there are a certain population, and oftentimes Black students and or students with disabilities are the students who are oftentimes the ones who receive the punitive measures from schools. And so the fact that we have made progress over this time period where we can say that there has been a reduction, we don't want to go back, right? We want to keep moving forward, and we want to continue to reduce those numbers, right? So that our young people aren't negatively impacted by being suspended or expelled. If I'm a parent of a student with disabilities or with a different ability, why should I care about stopping this particular bill, HB 247?
Jenny Orella, would you like to hop in here?
Sure. So we know that students with disabilities are disproportionately suspended from school, both short and long-term suspended. They're right around the 20% mark of kids that are suspended from school, but students with disabilities make up about 13% of the school population year after year, very consistent number. So we know that will affect these students with disabilities and Black students as well. And then also sometimes some of these more subjective behaviors that might be considered offensive or threatening or disrespectful. Sometimes because students with disabilities might process the school environment differently than other students, they're more likely to make what would be deemed an inappropriate statement to a teacher or a peer or an administrator. And so it just the frequency at which that happens means that they are also much more likely to be in the principal's office. And what happens in these situations is the principal then, basically this bill is going to give that principal the power to long-term suspend that student for that one offense. And right now, a student could be long-term suspended for multiple offenses of the same type. So there's an aggravating circumstances part of any long-term suspension consideration, where if the student is doing the same behavior over and over and over again, that can be considered aggravating enough to move something from a short-term to a long-term suspension. So there, if that's the case, then, that may or may not be appropriate. We don't think that suspension helps anybody or anything. So, but under the rules, that could still happen as they are currently written. In part to answer one of the questions that was in the chat, what legislators are trying to do with this bill is to give that discretion back to the school districts. But what we expect to happen is, if this bill passes, then school districts are all going to revise their codes of conduct at the next board meeting. And they're going to then put the language back in for subjective infractions into the long-term suspension category, because that's where they were before this big effort was made in 2010. That's why the numbers have gone down. And so this would be really just, turning the clock back by more than 10 years on the progress that has been made.
Yeah, and I like to add as well, like just on a very basic level, students with disabilities, they're not always, with their instructors or their teachers that are trained and prepared to deal with them throughout the day. They go to the cafeteria, they go to specials, they're in general education courses. They walk from class to class. So they have interactions with other teachers. They have interactions with student resource officers, SROs, right? So, dependent upon what types of abilities or disabilities that they have, they may not be in tune with the same social contract, right? And understand that what they're expected and how they're expected to respond to certain things, right? And that's why that inappropriate language, that defiance, these issues, these very subjective things can be extremely problematic for students with disabilities. In Wake County, the Legal Aid of North Carolina, they wrote a complaint with the Department of Justice 10 years ago, and they used examples of students, and 7 of the 8 students were students who had disabilities, and they outlined within that complaint the different things that they faced, and it was situations just as I just said, where there was some type of issue, and then they ended up going to prison, or having some type of thing that was not necessary, just because they had some type of interaction, and sometimes outside of the classroom. So that's something to also consider, because the entire school day is encompassed within this.
Yeah, and we also have to think about the fact that suspensions and expulsions and referrals to law enforcement within the school context have long-term and lasting impacts on young people's lives, right? And oftentimes, one decision by an administrator or a school resource officer targeted towards a particular kid. And if we think about a student with disabilities whose disability may not be known or even taken into consideration, the change in their life could be catastrophic. And I often, doing this work and being a parent and being in the school, oftentimes I feel like there is a level of disregard for that one decision having a long-term impact on a student's life, right? And I think the one of the harms of this particular bill, if it's passed through, is again to create opportunities for more of those harms to be meted out on young people who don't deserve them. If you're a parent, if you have interaction with children in general, you know young people will make a mistake. Their brains are still developing. They may not make the right choice, but do they deserve the punitive measures that oftentimes show up and target particular populations, and it's Black and Brown and students with disabilities? They don't. I don't believe so. And I think those of you who are joining us on this call, who are watching this on Facebook Live, one of the reasons why we're hosting this community conversation is that we don't believe this. Disability Rights doesn't believe this. Education Justice Alliance doesn't believe that. And so we're calling on you all, calling you in, right, to understand the harms that this particular bill could met out on our students and in our communities, because it has long-term impact. Felicia, I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in if you wanted to add anything to the conversation that we've been having thus far.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think one of our sort of points of unity for NC SPAN is that we agree that we should have more counselors, not cops, which is how sort of I think we connected with Education Justice Alliance in the first place. And so I do just want to bring that back up too, that by allowing law enforcement to be part of creating the student conduct part, right, that gives them more power to sort of get their foot in the door, right? Not that they already have a lot of power, right, within school systems. So to the extent that we can sort of decrease their presence within school systems, that's something that we're always behind. We always say, I think too, that, right, the police are not going to police themselves, right? Clearly, I think if you live, depending on where you live, we know that that's not the case. And so to offer up sort of more opportunities for them to do that is just not going to be aligned with the way that I think we want our students to be moving through the K through 12 system, or even beyond that, right? So I'm also a professor, and so we have these same questions about university police, right? And so whether or not they should be sort of having this access. And I also want to point out too that we've had some school boards make some like moves to actually limit the sort of like movement of law enforcement. I'm just thinking of obviously like the great work that y'all have been doing in Wake County, but also thinking about a few years ago, and one of the things that I really drew me to really thinking about how this works were some of the cases in Durham, especially right after the cases of immigrant students being picked up by ICE, right? And the ability for there to be a shift within the Durham Public Schools policies, whether or not that has come to fruition, I think that that's an ongoing question, but there at least was an attempt to try and make it so that investigations, some of the arrest, all of the things that have been mentioned before were being monitored in a different way, right? So at least like making sure that some of that communication with families, that there was much more sort of upfront discussions about school suspensions, why people could get suspended. And so I think we're actually, as you all have said, we're regressing, right? We need to actually be thinking more about how to limit the influence of law enforcement within our school systems for so many reasons that have already been mentioned. So I think I do just want to like make sure that people understand that. The other thing that I often think about too is that if you want to go the route of sort of reform in thinking about school resource officers, which we're not necessarily behind, and we encourage most of our local groups to decide that on their own, but even being able to figure out how school resource officers are trained, all of that is like very complex information. I think when I'm talking about this with my students, I tend to sort of think about, there is the school resource officer survey that gets done by the Department of Public Instruction. And you can clearly see that there isn't as much efforts going into crisis intervention training, right? So none of that is named in this proposal. There's not any of those things that I think if people wanted to see some progress moving forward, none of that is in this proposal, right? So I think that that's often the case that we get into is at the legislative route, like what can we sort of compromise on? And I don't quite see that as part of this proposal at this point.
I really appreciate you lifting up what's missing, right? And one thing that, comes to mind for me as I, looked at the bill and we've had discussions about it, and Alex mentioned, right, last summer, how we saw after the untimely, unfortunate murder of George Floyd, calls from across the country, right, to um, disband police, to defund police, to remove school resource officers from our public schools. And, for some of us who've been in this work for a long time, the work of removing police from schools has been happening across the country for 10 plus years. And we've seen school districts across the country, starting in Minneapolis, to end their contracts with police officers. So, when I think about what could be the impetus for these folks who are pushing this bill, it almost feels like a retaliation or a pat on the back to say, oh, we know these folks is in the street. The communities are saying they don't want police, or to defund the police, to take those resources and invest them in community. But for us, we think police should be a part of this aspect of schooling. And to your point, Felicia, no, they should not be. At all. They have no place in schools, in my opinion. Alex, is there anything else you'd like to add to this conversation before we switch over to some of the numerous questions I see popping up in the chat box?
Yeah, so I mean, there's no research, definitely no research studies that show that police officers or school resource officers make schools safer. Um, uh, that's a really crucial piece, because the argument a lot of times is school safety, right? But if we look at an instance, a very clear instances of mass shootings in schools, we see that the school resource officers were either unable to do anything about it, or in unfortunate situation actually ran from the situation themselves, as unfortunate as that is. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
And I appreciate you naming that, because I think one of the things that happens in our larger community, but then when we drill it down to the school community, is that fear is oftentimes used as the mechanism to slide things in that we may not normally accept, right? And so to like name that the fear of school shootings can't be stopped by having school resource officers. There hasn't been anything to show us that that's an effective way to stop that from happening, is an important part of this conversation. And then I'd also just have to lift up EJA for numerous years has been calling for the removal of school resource officers in Wake County Public Schools, but also asking Wake County Public Schools to use funding to divert funds from school resource officers to a different or an alternative, right? And we call them peace builders or crisis intervention workers, right? Where it would be someone who's trained in de-escalation tactics and conflict resolution, and who has the ability to build relationships with students, staff, and families of students within the school community. Someone who would be charged with helping to shift the school community or the culture of the school community to one that's not punitive, but one that's welcoming and inviting. And if you talk to young people, which we have, they will tell you what they want in their schools is to feel loved, to feel supported. So why, as a society, why wouldn't our legislators be thinking about what could they do from the standpoint of creating laws that actually allow us to create spaces in our schools that actually speak to the whole child, right? The whole student, that creates a nurturing environment. So, we would argue that to include law enforcement in any type of discipline issue isn't the way. It's actually the opposite of that, is to take funds to create laws that allow for the type of positions that I just named. So I'll look in the chat right now and answer or say some of the questions. Go ahead, Alex. Yes, I saw you.
Yeah, and I just want to lift up something that you said. I mean, it's more than your opinion. The research shows that in various communities, definitely urban, inner city, and predominantly Black and low income communities, students do not feel safe. They actually feel less safe when they have SROs in their schools because of the experiences that they have both inside and outside of schools.
Thank you for validating my opinion, Alex. I knew it was more than my opinion, but you know, sometimes you get on a roll and you own it. So appreciate that. So the very first question that I saw in the chat was, if this goes into effect, would this be across K through 12 public schools that this particular bill would impact? And I believe the answer is yes. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right, and y'all been heavy in the chat with questions, so y'all bear with me as I try to dig through and find them all. Okay, so this may seem like a very naive question, but what justification can they make to push this bill through? Anybody have any insight into the justification?
So I mean, we can talk about the justification that they're trying to use, right? That there are teachers and administrators that feel as though they will face lawsuits if they suspend students for cursing. And the discussion on the committee floor was just talking about what if this student curses out a teacher or whatever. Well, whereas you may feel like that's not a problem. Well, I might feel like that's a problem. So it should be up to our discretion whether or not when students start cursing, we can suspend them. So in my opinion, it's actually fairly shallow. And I'll go as I'll dare to say that in this situation, knowing society, knowing education, you can't make that type of decision without recognizing the racial implications of it. So from my opinion, it is precisely a racial, if nothing else, a racially ignorant decision to make.
I appreciate that, Alex. Here's another question. It says, if this bill was to pass, do individual districts have the power to put restorative practices in place and basically reject this bill? Can they choose not to suspend, expel, or seclude / restrain their students?
I can answer that. Yes, I mean, they could decide not to change their school board policies, but generally boards of education will put into effect, generally, not always, but not every school district, but sort of the most stringent code of conduct that they can in order to meet that we're keeping everybody safe. We have an orderly school, to meet that standard that they feel like they are obliged to meet.
Appreciate that. There's a question, has Education Justice Alliance or DRNC written better language for HB 247 that they can share? I'll speak for Education Justice Alliance and definitely will let you all speak. We don't think there is a need for better language. We just think that this bill should be removed, that it is invalid. There's no need for it from our perspective, but you DRNC, please let us know what.
I mean, just for me, it would be a pipe dream to see even more examples. I've seen examples of legislation in other states in which they're even more aggressive about the types of behaviors that do not warrant a long-term suspension, to where they're even decriminalizing the possession of drugs and alcohol, right? So clearly we're not there yet in the state of North Carolina, but I do feel like that's where we need to continue to push our legislators. We need to continue to push our advocacy to move away from these stringent and punitive codes of conduct and really think about decriminalizing the school space as a whole.
I appreciate that. And there's a question that I think is rhetorical, but I think like feeds right into what you just said, Alex, which is, where is the bill that requires every school to have a crisis team in place that has proper training to use de-escalation techniques that are evidence-based and target understanding behaviors and safely diffusing issues instead of punishing them? Yeah, where is that bill at? Where's the author? Where's the champion for that? Because that, we know, is what we need in our schools, and that is what would make sense and help our young people. So thank you, Holly, for that. All right, I'm scrolling, y'all. Oh, do we know where the State Board of Education stands on this bill? Do they have any influence on whether or not this bill could pass?
So we think that they may, and we're working on figuring that out. I don't know that it would be a united front on how they stand, but there are conversations going on.
Appreciate that. All right, let's see. Becca, are there any questions on Facebook that you've seen?
There are not.
Okay, perfect. And then, so we're about 10 minutes left, and I know there's some call to actions that, you know, we would like to talk about, or even strategies. I think Felicia talked a little bit about strategy in her earlier comments, but if there's any strategies that we want to share with the community that would help in our advocacy to get this bill, to stop this bill, this would be a perfect opportunity for you all to share.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate. I think whenever, and my current work is both sort of supporting efforts to push back against criminalization bills more broadly. So we did a little bit of work specifically when Senate Bill 100 was introduced, which we call the anti-defund bill for North Carolina. And part of that was actually directly targeting the sponsors, and the sponsors are the people who introduce it, right? So to give a little bit more context, that was also introduced alongside an anti-immigrant bill. And so we both did some petitions and actions specifically focused on those people who introduced the bill, one of them being out here in Western North Carolina, which is where I live. And some of that was very much like a response to the protests that occurred after the murder of George Floyd. So you mentioned that before, Letha, and that was very much the case, right? They said that, they went to a press conference and they said, this is why we're doing this. So we both sort of take the stance of like targeting those individuals and letting them know that it's not okay, like that this is racist, right? And also, I think on this particular one, and I'll sort of definitely punt this back to the disability rights folks too, but I think asking and getting some intel from your local school board, right? Just seeing where they stand on this. I would say that potentially some of the school boards are not going to be the most progressive because, again, if the school boards are welcoming school resource officers and law enforcement into your schools, then they may not actually be the direction to go. But it's good to always know where they stand, right, on these particular proposals. We do find that often, like, if those local communities are willing to put pressure on the representatives, that also works, right? So it's not just contacting the people who are going to be voting on the proposal, but also seeing who influences them, right? And so it's a little bit clearer for us when we're talking about like anti-immigrant legislation, because of sort of like who matters in those sense. But with this one, I think, yeah, getting parents to approach their school boards and asking sort of like where they stand on that, and making it clear that this is not something that we want to see move forward, I think is really important, especially I think in this moment. Yeah, I think one of my biggest questions always, especially that folks were online for so long, was that there were school resource officers that had to be reassigned. They can stay, I guess, reassigned, and we don't actually need them, right, in the community in general, but specifically, we don't want them back in schools. So I think that there is some sort of local pressure that we can put on folks to at least like get to hear where they're at, on this particular issue. And then it sounds like some things are already moving to sort of see where the governor is at in this process, with so many of the proposals, because of the state legislature being majority Republican in both houses. We typically also recommend, right, like going straight to the governor and trying to get some comments from his office to see wherever he is on this as well. So that's the only sort of things. We do also like encourage like faith communities to do sign-on letters. I know that there is a sort of general sign-on letter, but it's always nice to sort of have those folks also readily available to come talk to at the General Assembly, right? I know COVID-19 makes this a little bit more challenging, but it's always nice for not the same people to always be showing up, right? I think together we're stronger and able to at least give a much more sort of holistic approach to why we care, right? And I think there's so many pieces here that we can definitely sort of like write language around and make sure that people recognize that this is why we care about this issue.
Thank you for that. And I did drop in the chat box. So we are publicly launching a letter tonight, and we're asking for you all to sign on. And that link is in the chat. You can sign on via an organization if you're connected to an organization, or you can sign on as an individual in our advocacy effort to stop this bill. We currently, I think, have about 50 sign-ons between individuals and organizations, and we welcome you all joining us in this advocacy effort to stop this bill. There's also going to be a social media push next week. And so I'll let Alex speak a little bit about that. I do want to say, once we've gathered all the signatures for this letter, we will be sending the letter over to the legislature and the governor's office to let them know the community stands behind removing or ending HB 247. So Alex, go ahead and share a little bit about the social media push next week.
Yes, so the social media push, we're gonna start it on Tuesday morning. We're gonna be doing it throughout the day, just trying to get the attention of lawmakers in the state, using the hashtag Stop H247. You can also in school push out as well. And with this, we really want to contact the Twitter handles of those lawmakers as well, to make sure they know that we're here and we're not going to stand for it as well. I think that's all the information for that.
Yep. And you can find, we'll have it listed on the DRNC Facebook page, as well as on EJA, Education Justice Alliance's Facebook page, those Twitter handles, as well as the hashtags that you can use to tweet at. I'm feeling a little hip tonight because I don't normally use this language. So we again invite you to sign the letter and join us in our advocacy efforts, and to join us next Tuesday in our social media storm to get the attention of the folks who we have elected to represent us, so that they know what it is that we want them to do in the case of HB 247. Will a guide for the
one last, there's
Yeah.
one more question about a social media guide.
Oh, yes. So at DRNC, we have a communications team that we're working with, and they're putting together a toolkit for us, hopefully to have graphics and a tagline and information, so that you won't have to wreck your brain to figure out what to say. We'll have some things for you to say, so that it'll be simple. It'll be simplified for you. If you sign on to the letter and you leave your email address, then we will be sending that out through that email address.
Thank you, Becca, for gently reminding us of that. And again, we just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Appreciate all the questions and comments in the chat and your attention to this very important matter. And we look forward to your further support in our efforts. Thank you, and you all have a good night.